afternoon. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you. Welcome to our Saturday afternoon presentation at Chik-Wauk Museum and Nature Center. We're very fortunate to have Joe Friedrichs here today, and I'm going to put my cheaters on so I can read his bio that he has written here for me. Joe is a journalist and a writer, and he lives near the Boundary Waters Canoery Wilderness in northern Minnesota. He has 2 books out, and we're going to be talking about Last Entry Point today. His other book is Her Island, and he is a fabulous writer, and I've known him more when he was writing Her Island to a good friend of ours. And so he's an environmental and outdoor writer. He is recognized with an honorable mention for Journalism of the Year by the Minnesota Society of Professional Journalists in 2023. Woo-hoo! His writing has appeared in Backpacker, the Star Tribune, and Minnesota Outdoor News. In 2024, Joe founded Paddle and Portage, a digital media company focused on the Boundary Waters. And if you ever see any of his posts on Facebook, they're just phenomenal. You got to check that out. I'm sure he'll talk a little bit about that. So Joe and I had a little conversation. I'm going to say this. He reminded me at 2:30 to let him know that, hey, it's 2:30 and then 2:45. And I said, well, do you want me to flash you? And he goes, our good friend Janice would have done that. Yes, that would have been perfect. So I hope you will enjoy. And if you have any questions afterwards, Joe will have a question and answer.
Okay, well, thank you, Bonnie. We all look forward to 2:30, I'm sure.
You might get the whole crowd to do this. Speak for yourself. It might not be pretty.
And thank you all for being here today. Gunflint Trail community, very special place, and one that I know about a little bit and have spent a lot of time up the Gunflint. I arrived here at Rockwood Lodge in 2012. That's how I discovered this area, the Boundary Waters, so it's an important place to me, the Gunflint Trail. I'm going around Minnesota all summer now into the fall and talking about Last Entry Point and the book, the process, the Boundary Waters, what it is. And I love coming to a place like this, to Chik-Wauk, where you don't really have to explain much about why this place is important, what the Boundary Waters is, and why we all care about it, why we're here today to talk about these stories of real things that happen out there. And a lot of us have been touched by those stories or know about them. So that's what we'll do today, talk about how I put together Last Entry Point, this book that came out in April. But for anybody that's visiting Chik-Wauk, certainly there's probably some people from outside the Gunflint community or Cook County that are here today. The Boundary Waters, which is like right over there, basically on Sag and Seagull, and this area here at the end of the Gunflint Trail. Massive wilderness area. Superior National Forest itself is a huge area in northeastern Minnesota here. Boundary Waters, 1.2 million acres, designated for a long time. People have worked to advocate, protect, just set up rules and regulations to keep this place pristine as it is, including Wilderness Act of 1964, which was celebrated 60 years ago, this month actually, and then the 78 Wilderness Act too that helped just kind of further that protection specific for the Boundary Waters. Not without its contention through those processes of people's cabins being taken out of what's now the BWCA, and there's some rocky roads to get to where we are today, and that advocacy also continues to protect this place. Well, let's talk about how this book came to be, Last Entry Point, which indeed, as the title of the book suggests, is about stories of danger and even death, people who died in the Boundary Waters, including on Sag here, and also on Seagull. They're both in the book, people who died on these lakes right here outside the museum. But there's one story that started the book for me in particular. And it's this young gentleman in the middle here of this, and with his longtime girlfriend, Natalie Yakonis. That's Billy Cameron is his name, 29-year-old man from Noblesville, Indiana, and I worked at WTIP. Should say just a little bit more about my time here in Cook County. Is I worked at WTIP, the radio station, for about 10 years. Was the news director there, and started something called the Boundary Waters Podcast, which we've now moved to Paddle and Portage. But we did a lot of Boundary Waters news there because it's an important thing that happens in Cook County, and WTIP's world of news and information is related to Boundary Waters. Let's see, we can go back to that slide.
Sorry.
No, no, okay.
Touchy.
Yeah, sensitive. So, if we go back to May 2020, just reflect back in your mind what was happening in the world at that time. We've got COVID happening. It's still the very early stages of the pandemic. A lot of uncertainty and just general society. Then we have George Floyd killed in Minneapolis, murdered in Minneapolis that same month, Memorial Day. So May, just go there in your mind about where society was at, where Minnesota was at that time. I'm working at the radio station. We've limited it to a few people that are coming in and out of the building, usually 1, 2 at a time at the most. A few select people still going live on the air. I was one of those people. Did a morning news show from 7 to 8 for many years at WTIP. And when somebody dies in the Boundary Waters, which happens multiple times, usually every year, the average is just under 2. It's like 1.76 is something like that. If you look at over the years, how many people die and so forth. And so when that happens, when somebody dies in the Boundaries, we get a notification in a newsroom like WTIP from Cook County Sheriff's Department, Lake County, St. Louis County. They send out a press release to the news, Duluth, Star Tribune, WTIP, etc. It's always the same version of a different person. Name, what lake they were on, maybe the conditions, if they were wearing a life jacket. That's about it. Scant, limited information. And I had been the news director for 8 years at that time, working at WTIP. So I'd read a number of these. I'd seen a number of these come across our news desk. This individual died on Pine Lake. This person died on Jasper. Over the years, it just either built in me, or it was the combination of that, the intersection of the societal stress, the pandemic, everything colliding at once. But for whatever reason, after I read that morning that Billy Cameron died on Tuscarora Lake, their canoe capsized, he died. Young man, Billy Cameron died. Up next, here's the news from the Lucin Town Hall. Just on to the next story, as it happens in a newsroom across this country. And that day, though, I remember specifically sitting in the studio at WTIP and feeling pissed off. I just didn't like that I just said this limited information about somebody who died on Tuscarora Lake, right up the trail, not far from here. And so I wanted to do something more. I wanted to learn who this person was that I just talked about. Just said they died. Who was this individual? So I started looking around online, and I came across a Facebook post that Natalie had put up that morning. This was the day after Billy died on Tuscarora. And I sent her a message from the WTIP Facebook account, and I said, my name's Joe, I live in Grand Marais, Minnesota, that's near where Billy died on the Gunflint Trail, and I'm wondering if you have any stories that you'd like to share about Billy. And just left it at that, very simple. Immediately I could see, like how when you text someone you can see if they're texting you back. I could see that someone was responding right away. And it was Natalie, and she said, yes, I want to talk to you about Billy, and I want to use this to tell people to be safe out there. The ice had come out late that year. The water was still extremely, dangerously cold. And she wanted to have a conversation about that, to talk about Billy, and to set up as a word of caution for other paddlers coming up in late May that year. Set it up on Zoom, talked to Natalie later that day, recorded it, It was a very powerful conversation, beautiful conversation. Natalie's a nurse now in Ohio, a very smart, sensitive, compassionate human being. And put it on the air. The next day was a Friday. Now, we aired it. 3 things happened after that. 3 types of reactions. I heard from people who said, Joe, wow, thank you for airing that very powerful interview with Natalie. Those stories were beautiful, and the words of caution meant a lot, and thank you for doing that. The other reaction was, wow, that's really must have been so hard for Natalie, and you know, we appreciate WTIP being sensitive to that and just being respectful to her grieving that she was going through. And the third reaction was, how dare you, Joe, reach out to this person who is hurting at this time and pry into her world and exploit that grief. So what that showed me was that people were interested in hearing about Billy Cameron's story. Most stories that we do in a newsroom, a newspaper, a radio station, they just are one-offs. You don't hear anything. You can work for hours and hours, days of journalism. You don't hear a thing. So when I heard that kind of reaction from this interview with Natalie, I knew I was on to something. And so I wanted to hear more. I wanted to learn more of these stories. What happened to Billy? He was out with his friends. They drove up. This photo here is on their way up from Indiana. And that's on Billy's birthday, the day before they entered through Round Lake. They stayed at the bunk room at Tuscarora that night, went in, and they were on the island there. There's an island campsite on Tuscarora. Beautiful, beautiful campsite. Billy was casting from shore. The lure got snagged. They hopped in the Minnesota 3, a Winona canoe that they had rented from Tuscarora Outfitters from Ada and Andy, and went out to unsnag the lure. In that process, somehow things got capsized. It was a windy, very, very windy day, and they all went in wearing their life jackets. All 3 of them were wearing their life jackets. The 2 friends made it to shore, spent the night on distant shores, and it's believed that Billy had what's called a dry drowning, where his throat, his body just essentially seized up and he suffocated. We took in some water and eventually listed as hypothermia drowning on the coroner's report, but it's a non-medical term of dry drowning. Is basically what happened to Billy. So I learned all that through Natalie, through Billy's parents, his family, beautiful people, and started the journey of Last Entry Point with that story. Wanted to know who these other people were I've been talking about for the past 8 years when I read those 1-paragraph things over the airwaves, and who are people that have come before them, and even more importantly perhaps, what are we going to learn and use these stories for? How can they help other people stay safe in the boundary waters? Up ahead. So what I wanted to work with and who I started to reach out with through the process of finding the names of people who died in the boundary waters were my contacts at Search and Rescue. And there are some elite, absolutely elite search and rescue units, including the Gunflint Trail unit, which I'll talk about later in the presentation, in and around the boundary waters. From St. Louis County is the largest, and they're based in Hermantown near Duluth, but they have on the Iron Range in Virginia, and also in Ely, they cover that area. Lake County is also a very good search and rescue unit. They're much more lower profile, and then of course our local team here on the Gunflint. So I started making calls and saying, hey, I'm working on stories about people who died in the boundary waters or been in very dangerous situations. How would you like to help me share that in an effective, accurate way? And it took some time to get to that. And you can hop ahead, Bonnie. This gentleman right here was the key to it all. His name's Rick Slatton. He is the captain of the St. Louis County Rescue Squad. His father started the St. Louis County Rescue Squad with a handful of other people way back when, in the 50s, and Rick has taken it over. He's a very serious individual. He's no nonsense kind of a person, and his first reaction to me was, who the hell are you and what do you want from me? And so I had to spend time talking to Rick and explaining what my objective was, which is to keep people safe on their canoe trips and so they can come home. Here's my experiences in the Boundary Waters. I'm not in the Twin Cities. I'm not somebody that's just fly by night here. I'm invested in this community. I care about it, and I want to share these stories as accurately as possible. I need your help to do that. And eventually, Rick sort of came around, if you will. We had many conversations in person in Duluth at the St. Louis County Rescue Squad headquarters, where they have all kinds of equipment, looking at maps, going through files that are essentially confidential, but we were able to look at them and not take some of the gritty details, if you will. But a lot of information was shared. That's the point. And talking with Rick, I talked with him more than any other source for the book. He is not just really good at what he does around here. He and his wife, who has now unfortunately passed away, have gone around the country and taught search and rescue theory, methods, the science behind it to people in Colorado, East Coast, all over the United States, in Canada for that matter. So Rick is top tier search and rescue person. Cannot say enough about how important he was to Last Entry Point and getting things right, explaining the science. You know, the idea that Rick likes to share, and he would certainly say, I'm sure if he was here today, is that search and rescue isn't, okay, somebody's in distress, let's fan out, walk through the woods, and hopefully we'll stumble upon them. It's a mathematical, there's science, numbers, data, all that's input, and then we go. Then we find it's coordinated, it's very orchestrated from the end of the Gunflint here to Duluth. It's not just, okay, let's go. And how to explain that process and why some people die, why they get to some people are safe. It's just really explained in Last Entry Point. If you haven't read it, you'll find out. And when you read the book, and if you have, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, and certainly in terms of Rick. You might recognize this gentleman on the left here, pretty well known around these parts, certainly. Michael Valentini, who, at least for now, lives kind of right over there. Michael's planning to move here before too long, but hopefully he stays around as long as possible. He's sort of, if you want to think about the equivalent of our version of Rick Slatton here locally. Michael's really well known here in the Gunflint community. He's been on search and rescue for a long time and leads and coordinates and does a lot of things when those calls come in for search and rescue on this side of the wilderness. Looks like we got some nice rain coming down now. How beautiful that is. Michael is just absolutely involved in the happenings of this place. He also provided information. I know Michael for a long time and have worked with him on stories, including hard stories where people have died on the Gunflint side here. And others, I worked with Michael on a story about a gentleman from Iowa State professor who got lost on the Border Route Trail, and his bear spray deployed in his face, and then he sort of hunkered down on Partridge Lake, I believe it was Partridge, and sat there and waited for days rather than, he was lost, he didn't know where he was, he didn't have a GPS type of thing, he didn't have a beacon to call for help, so he just stayed put rather than risk sort of getting more lost than he already was. And Michael praised him. He wrote a letter in the News Herald about that and talked with me about it too. So you'll hear about and read about Michael Valentini in Last Entry Point, and another great contribution from Michael as search and rescue, how it works, what they do, what happens when you push that button on your beacon. Here's what's going to roll out and unfold from there. When you should push it, maybe when you should kind of hold off, all these things that we talk about in the book. This unit here in the middle is called Lester. It's an underwater drone camera, sonar type thing, if you want to think about it like that. They just got it, the Gunflint Trail crew, this summer, I believe, maybe last fall. I think they picked it up from the St. Louis County Rescue Squads. Rick and his crew upgraded some of their stuff, and they sold this to the Gunflint crew, and it's named Lester because last summer a young man, an Amish kid from Wisconsin, Lester Hoschetler, drowned on Gillis Lake, which is not far from here, sort of as the crow flies, south of Tuscarora, a couple portages. And they were having a hard time finding Lester. The Gunflint crew was. A day or two, I think, had gone by. And then they called in Rick, and then the other guys from St. Louis County came in with this unit, I believe it was, and found him, I think, within a few hours. And so now they have this sort of technology at their fingertips, which is a very important tool that they have. And they named it Lester in honor of Lester Hoschstetler. Michael called the Hoschstetler family in Wisconsin and made sure that that was okay before he did that. This photo on the right is from just down the road. Jess Coleman, who probably a lot of you might know that name, Mike Berg and the Seagull Creek Fishing Camp. That's from a storm that took place this summer where trees were coming down all over the Gunflint, the flooding over in Ely. I think that was June 18th this summer. And I put that photo in because a young boy on Snipe Lake was injured in that storm, and the crews went out from Round Lake. They dispatched from the near Tuscarora head office there and went in the storm and got that young boy where he was treated, hit him in the head. It was a very serious, life-threatening type situation. Heard that young boy is doing okay now back home. So these things continue. It's not like Last Entry Point comes out and that's the end of it. This is an evolving, ongoing thing, and so that was a big part of the book too. This is just a look back, and we're gonna know hopefully how this works and how we can stay safe moving forward. We've got some fires burning right now. I talk about fire in the wilderness in the book as well. One of the things that people maybe are most afraid of, at least, that are from outside the area. Oh my gosh, there's going to be a fire. I've even had some text messages just the past few days. How close are those fires? Are you safe? Are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, over here on the North Shore, and these fires are over by Ely. It's just this idea of fire in the Boundary Waters really strikes something in people who maybe aren't as familiar with the wilderness as we are and that type of thing. But there are some active wildfires burning. We've had these low humidity days, warm temperatures, and don't need to talk too much and tell you folks about the Ham Lake fire, of course, and these major events that have impacted the Gunflint community over the years. I do talk about the Ham Lake fire in the book, and as Michael Valentini told me, there's one death that we associate with the Ham Lake fire, and that's Stephen Wozniak, who started the fire. I believe in an accidental fire. He later committed suicide. I talked with his wife, his widow, I should say, in the book, and there's a conversation that her and I have about that. So we definitely talk about fire. I do in Last Entry Point. And these are some controlled burns the Forest Service was doing this spring. The Pagami fire is another one that I talk about at length. There's a very detailed account of a fire that took place 2011 when the Pagami was burning, and this couple who had come from Michigan every year to the Boundary Waters, they're in the fire. And I talked with them about their experience literally jumping into the lake to escape the flames. Her kayak got helicoptered away from her as she was tossed out of it. She's riding these waves they can't see, coughing and choking on ash and smoke, and they vividly tell me about that experience in the book. But fire doesn't necessarily, people don't usually sort of get caught in the fire. It's more this idea of fire. What most of the people who die in the Boundary Waters die from is cold water. Cold water drownings are the thing that scare Rick and other people the most. And Andy at Tuscarora, who I talk with a lot too in the book, is this thing that he talks about a lot, cold water drownings. And then weather-related things, not fire, but trees, wind, and these types of things that happen, in addition to medical emergencies like heart attacks and things that happen that search and rescue respond to as well. Here's another story that I did a major deep dive into. So Billy Cameron starts the book. We can think about his story as sort of the beginning of Last Entry Point. That's the young man who I talked about from Indiana at the beginning. Jordan Grider was the one that I spent the most time researching. And his story is very unique, both to the book and to the Boundary Waters. Jordan grew up in New Mexico. He was the same age as Billy, 29 years old. He was dyslexic, lived in Moriarty, New Mexico, very rural, poor part of New Mexico. It's about an hour and some change east of Albuquerque, kind of a high desert, mountainous type terrain. A unique family, I would say. They were all homeschooled, 6 boys in the family. He had some trouble with alcohol and got in trouble with the law throughout his life, and including his adult life. So he left home, he wandered east. He ended up trying to sell alligators in New York for a while. Found his way down to Kentucky. Now he's squatting on some land owned by Mennonites in Kentucky. Got in trouble with an incident with a gun and a domestic situation. Alcohol problems continuing. Goes home for about a month. Mom and Dad are saying, you gotta do something here, kid. You know, this isn't gonna work, just you sort of lying around drinking. He set his hammock up in the house. He just had some problems. He had definite problems adjusting to society. He blamed a lot of things on the woes of society, the politics of life, and the struggle of adapting, you could say. Well, he had hiked part of the Appalachian Trail, which is where this photo is taken. And on that hike, somebody told Jordan, hey, you ever heard of a place called the Boundary Waters? Man, it seems like it'll be right up your alley. You can really get away from it up there. You should check that place out. And he just made a mental note of that while he was hiking the Appalachian Trail. So while his parents are giving him a hard time, he's back home, he's in trouble, he's broke. He says, all right, I'm going up there. I'm going to the Boundary Waters. Nobody's going to bother me there. His parents are saying no. His brother tries to talk him out of it. He goes. He drives from New Mexico to Ely, buys some rice, some beans. It's late October, and he was going to spend the winter in the Boundary Waters. That was his plan. In a hammock, not a good hammock. He had a 30-degree sleeping bag and some other blankets. He's got this rice, these beans, big jug of vodka, and he went. So he parks at the Sioux Hustler Trail, and he's which is off the Echo Trail. If you've been over there, you know where that area is. And he bushwhacks off the trail so that nobody finds him. He's not looking for a campsite with a nice westerly view, you know, sort of the pristine experience of the Boundary Waters. He's looking for total solitude, absolutely left alone. He's here to spend the winter. From what they can gather, search and rescue, law enforcement, he made it for 2 nights before he was eaten by wolves, and that's how he spent his final days on Earth, in the Boundary Waters. It's not likely, based on many interviews that I did about that with both like Seth Moore, the biologist in Grand Portage, as well as the DNR, the people who found Jordan and his remains, and the people I talked with, forensics people and so forth that you read in the book, that the wolves didn't like circle around him while he was stirring the coals in the fire and leap on him. They believe that Jordan injured himself with probably a hatchet or an axe. He usually had one of those, and they didn't find it at the campsite. So it's presumed that he hit an artery or injured himself, gouged himself with that hatchet somewhere away from the camp, made it back to the hammock. There's blood splattered on the tarp that he had set up, and a pool of blood in the hammock itself. And so then the wolves came in and dragged him out of the hammock and ate him after he had died. That's the reasoning, or the belief in that. The next one. This is Jordan's mother. That's me in New Mexico. Went down there to meet his folks and see where he grew up and learn a little bit more about who Jordan Grider was. Who's this person that was eaten by wolves in the Boundary Waters and lived this nomadic life, and kind of a Chris McCandless, if you recall Krakauer's book Into the Wild, and There's some comparisons made about them, although just a lot different in terms of education and perhaps motivation and even intelligence, I think it would be fair to say. But Rebecca Grider welcomed me into their home, made lunch for my friend Peter, who's a journalist in Albuquerque, and I. Spent many hours there at their house learning about Jordan. I got to see Jordan's 13 bones and remains that had just arrived from the forensics lab about a week before I got there. They're going to bury those on their property that they have in New Mexico, and that was a pretty surreal kind of experience to see that with his dad there. And they're very, I mean, don't even think of them as, this doesn't matter, no judgment here, but beyond the political right in the sense of they're just extremists. They make their own ammunition, and they live a very unique life, you can say. So his dad's standing there while I'm holding this box of his son's bones, and just very powerful experiences that I had learning about who these people are that have died in the Boundary Waters. Also went to Kentucky and met the Mennonite family that let Jordan squat on their land. Fantastic people, probably the nicest people I've ever met anywhere. Food and abundance. And Joe, we wish you the best on your journey of making this book and sharing these stories, and how beautiful it was to meet some of these people too. The Minnesota Historical Society Press, who's the publisher of the book, was beyond generous and gracious with supporting me in my travels and intentions to meet these people, and never second guessing or questioning any of those things. No matter how sort of awkward or unusual it was. And Jordan's story, as I said, I spent so much time into it, and he's the outlier of these things. The original manuscript that I submitted to the Historical Society Press opened with Jordan Grider and ended with him. And there was a whole lot of Jordan in there. And my editor, Shannon, from the Historical Society Press said, the thing about Jordan, I know we've invested in this part of the book and your travels and these things and all the time, is that he's this outlier. There's probably not many people that are going to relate to his story in the sense of, I'm going up there and I'm spending the winter in my hammock in this kind of grove of balsam and not at a campsite. And just, there's not a lot of connection that people can have to him versus someone like Billy who loves the Boundary Waters, and they come every year and they capsize their canoe. That could happen to any of us. And so we really scaled back Jordan's involvement with the book as far as how much of Jordan Grider's in there. Took a lot of work to redo that last summer, but ultimately I'm very, very grateful for Shannon's recommendation on that. I think it's a much stronger story and book, having rearranged some of that. But Jordan Grider definitely interested me. I think there were even some layers probably of Jordan that I could relate to. Some of his ideology, however obscure and sort of out there it might seem, on some level I could kind of get where the guy was coming from. It's a weird world that we all navigate here, and I think that was part of my draw to him. Well, how about this fella? Happens to be standing right back there. Mark Zimmer, who we call the Barefoot Paddler, is somebody who's also in the book. So now I'm telling you today these stories about Billy and Jordan, people that Michael Valentini and Rick Slatton have had to go see, these really sorrowful, hard stories about death and danger, tragedy. But it's not all like that. That's not what the Boundary Waters is all about. That's not what most people's trips are like. And there's a lot of people who spend way more time than even Billy, and certainly more time than Jordan Grider, who don't get hurt. They come back year after year, and they're not injured, sick, or dying, or any of that kind of stuff happening to them. So I thought, who can embody that? Who is it that I know that goes out there a lot and has some situations that are on the edge, so to say, but they make it out okay? Well, we had met this gentleman, Barefoot Paddler, years before, and had done some interviews with him at WTIP, Mark goes in, barefoot paddler, in late spring, late April, early May every year, and lives in the Boundary Waters, and then comes out in the fall, works some construction and winter and so forth, makes some cash, and then hit repeat. And that's been happening for over 10 years at this point. So what I'm talking about, like, he goes in, he sort of comes out periodically, rarely, gets a resupply, sends some emails, whatever he's got to do. But generally, just think of it, he's living in the Boundary Waters every year, and that's how he functions and lives. So Mark became that person for me that could showcase that. He's the anecdotes to drive home that, look, you're probably not going to die out if you go on your canoe trip. You know, it was a fear of mine with writing this book was that it was going to keep people away from here or scare them off from here or something like that. It's absolutely not the point of the book. It's to how can we do this safely? How can we come home? So Mark then was the person who could show that for us. I got to interview him and talk with Mark specifically for Last Entry Point. We talked about Jordan Grider. We talked about the fact Jordan was drinking alcohol at camp excessively. Bad idea. Alcohol in the Boundary Waters, it's just unnecessary. I mean, a sip of whiskey around camp is one thing at the end of the day, but intoxication, bad combo. Things can happen out there with weather, and if you're drunk and a storm kicks up and trees are coming down, it's terrible. It just does, they don't match, they don't go together. So Mark and I were able to talk about that component of some of the situations in Last Entry Point and talk about safety in a canoe, paddling, portaging, and the thing about Mark is he does this all barefoot. That's why we call him the barefoot paddler. It's not just some sort of like generic nickname. The dude goes barefoot all the time. So he's like that next level up. Like, here's how you potentially could do this. As part of it, we coordinated with Mark to go out and meet him to do a specific interview for the book. And he's been eating fish all summer. This was like in August, so he's been in for months at this point, you know. And I knew that he'd been eating wild rice, fish, the staple. I mean, Mark catches a lot of fish, and that's what he eats. He forages and fishes. That's like his primary diet, and then some wild rice. So I went to Johnson's and picked up a big New York strip steak to take out, or a ribeye, maybe some nice steak. Let's just phrase it like that. And show up, met at Brule Lake, so we could coordinate pretty easily where to meet, and walk in. I can fill out a day permit, hop in, we go out to a site, and hey, I brought you this steak, you know. Oh, really? Yeah, okay, cool. So we cook up this steak, and I cook it medium rare, Mark, and just kind of sat back, and I got my notes, and I sort of set this up, you know. And so, hey, here's your steak, Mark. He grabs the thing, no utensils, even though we had some. Grabs a steak and just eats it. Not quite like an animal, but you know, like an animal. Went silent for a while. So that's in the book. It was just a beautiful moment, actually, to kind of witness such a thing. But yeah, Mark's contribution really played a big role in stepping back from the doom and gloom aspect that sort of drives through the book. There's definitely some serious heavy stuff in Last Entry Point. It's undeniable when you're talking about people who died and interviewing their family members, or people who were on the canoe trip when they died, that of course there's going to be a heavy undertone to the whole thing. But Mark helped us step out of that a little bit and go, yeah, wait, I can still go to the Boundary Waters, you know, like this dude's out there living for over a decade, from spring to fall, every year. It's all good, it's all right. I just gotta take what I learned from those other stories and apply it. So without Mark, I don't even know how I kind of would have brought that home. So I'm really appreciative for the time that Mark spent with me for Last Entry Point. His inclusion in the book is really helpful. Not to say, I mentioned this at the beginning, that things aren't continuing on. People are still dying. 3 people have died this summer in the Boundary Waters. This gentleman, Mark Ham, on the left from Duluth, passed away right the week after the fishing opener, right before Memorial Day. He died in the Ely side of the wilderness. Extremely accomplished canoer, goes to the Boundary Waters every year, professor at UMD, a psychologist, just a wonderful human, wonderful man from everything that I've learned from his family and his friends, who I wrote a story about Mark for Paddle and Portage after he passed away. And again, that same thing. What can we learn from this experience? And share some stories about these people who come here and come to the Boundary Waters. It's believed that he had a heart attack or some sort of medical emergency that took his life in the Boundary Waters. And so I do this story for Paddle and Portage, and it's a lot of interviews, and it's a very emotional piece. And Mark, there was the reason the family wanted to do the story in particular was because the St. Louis County Rescue Squad, and actually it was the Sheriff's Department, St. Louis County Sheriff's Department, said he wasn't wearing his life jacket. And so the BWCA.com threads and Facebook and these things, just people just laying it on, pissing me off. And people are just like, hey, the guy should have been wearing his life jacket, And the family took major issue with that because they believe, based on what the circumstances were when he was found, is that he was getting in or out of the canoe. He had the life jacket slung over one shoulder, so he's at camp. He's getting out or coming in. So like, he wasn't blatantly, he didn't have the life jacket stuffed under his pack up in the front. He always wore his life jacket. So I do this big story about that. Who's Mark Ham? Let's talk about him, but really emphasizing, kind of coming back time and again about the fact that he wore his life jacket all the time. This story pops up on a Saturday morning. Here's the photo of Mark that we use, and on first look, now we're a life jacket, right? So we start hearing from people, mostly good stuff, like the family, and then read the article. Thank you for doing the story about my father, the daughter who I worked with most directly for that story. I'd been in their house, looked at his maps. I mean, this is like days after this had happened. And then it got on the Facebook page for the Boundary Waters group, and the people came out. Yeah, nice story. Too bad he's not wearing his life jacket. Opens up that Discord. It's, I'm getting out of control on social media. This poor family, I'm dead. I'm pacing around the house on a Saturday morning, mad at myself. We overlooked this. How could we? Trying to get another photo from the family to switch them out. And I get a hold of the daughter, and she says, Joe, what do you mean? It's all good. What? Yeah, Dad's got his life jacket on. What? See this thing right down here? Those two yellow things? That's his inflatable thing. That's what he always wore. It pops up and inflates when he needs it. He is wearing his life jacket. So then I got to go on the Facebook and say, thank you for your observation, as you'll note in Exhibit A. And I'll express, I'm sure that you express your condolences to the family. So just that kind of stuff. You're dealing with death, people and grieving and high emotions, the most painful imaginable scenarios we're talking about here. And that when people use that to drive that wedge in, or be a smart ass, or make a point, or whatever it is, not cool. And so yeah, just to get to know these types of people who come to the Boundary Waters, get to learn about Mark Hammond. Look at this guy. You can just see in his face how much he loves being here in the Boundary Waters. And that's the common theme with basically everybody I talked to, with the exception of Jordan Driver. They loved that place, and they died in a place that they loved. And I, as this individual who I'm speaking with, as someone who's grieving, I take a certain comfort in that they died in this place that they love. This incident here on the right is the other people who died this summer, this year in the Boundary Waters. A very, very high profile situation at Curtin Falls, also on the Ely side of the wilderness. Probably, certainly in my time up here, and I would say probably in the history of the Boundary Waters, the most high profile media coverage situation in the Boundary Waters that involved someone dying. They were missing. They couldn't find the people for 2 weeks, 16 days before they were able to recover them. And this was Rick and the crew and all their advanced stuff. It took that long because the water was so high, and they were just churning in these rapids underneath Curtin Falls. CNN, it had original stories, not picking it up off the AP wire. Like, this was a major event. And it also brought something up for me. Bob Timmons from the Star Tribune called, and they were going to do a review of Last Entry Point, and they held off for a week because the people were still missing. and we're gonna hold off again the second week, and he's just like, Joe, I don't know, what do you think? Should we run this? Should we change the interview or do another interview? And I was like, Bob, this is what the book is about. This is the reality of what happens out here. What are we trying to hide, or what is there to be afraid of? This is what the whole book is about. The reality that these things can and do happen in the Boundary Waters. But I'm not going to tell the Star Tribune outdoor editor what to do or something like that. But I was just like, if it was me, I'd run it. I'm not sure what the hesitation's even about. And they did that Saturday, and got a lot of feedback from people about both the book and the situation at Curtain Falls. They merged together. So it continues. These situations continue. It could happen today. Somebody could capsize. The water's starting to get colder. Not yet necessarily because of this warm September we've been having, but it's going to be happening where the spring and the fall sort of bookend these dangerous times. That's when the outfitters, you talk to Andy at Tuscarora, the team at Voyager, people on the Ely side, they're going to be like, it's early and late that we're worried about people drowning and dying who have rented our stuff. So we're getting into that time again. And again, with Mark's help, Barefoot Paddler, able to step off some of these doom and gloom components, and the last entry point isn't all of that. And certainly the types of stories that I experience and share aren't all rooted in death and danger. That's just a component. That's what this book is about. But most of the stories about the Boundary Waters are great. These two young guys up top here, Brad and Jake, work at Voyager down at the end of the right here at the end of the Gunflint Trail. They did it's called the Ely Challenge earlier this summer, just in August, I think that was, and they hightailed it through the night under a full moon and paddled to Ely, and then you go and get a cheeseburger or something from Dairy Queen, and you mail a letter, and then you paddle back. And they did it. They broke this sort of non-official record that exists, but like epic paddling, epic stories, things that don't involve death and danger. This gentleman down here in the bottom left, Dave Seaton from Hungry Jack Outfitters, just recently, I think this month, not long ago at all, helped this loon that was in distress. Some other people from Hungry Jack Lake found this loon and had some fishing line wrapped around it. Hey, let's rally and step up and do something here. They did. The loon, as far as I can tell, that's Dave releasing it there. These are the stories that are like what the Boundary Waters is about. Places like the Gunflint, the community that's here is so strong and vibrant. I did a story about when the young cook at Trail Center passed away this winter after his accident, and other stories that I've done with Michael and people that have some hardship, that common theme in all those stories. The Trail Center cook to the story about these guys and the loon and Ely Challenge. It's all like about the strength of this community that exists here on the Gunflint. It's there on the Ely side too. I was so honored to get to step into those worlds and learn. I'm also so grateful to the families who talked with me for the book and shared some of those really powerful stories. Some people had to dig some of that up. They had lost people they loved decades before, and to have to revisit some of that was very hard for them. Also took a little bit of a toll on me. Hearing all those stories, it took me 3 years from start to finish to do the book, 2 of it actively engaged in the reporting process and hearing these stories sort of repetitively and analyzing them with people like Michael and Rick. Definitely, it took some stuff to work through. I used to not be able to get through these presentations without choking up, but now here in the fall, I've done a few of them and it's kind of been through that. But it was a very sort of exhaustive, but I feel important story and book to share. And from what I'm hearing from people all over the country at this point is that they're grateful that those stories were shared and that they learned something, and they took some of that knowledge that people like Rick and Michael and other people shared with them and felt safer on their canoe trip. Just heard over the weekend from someone who did a trip to Quetico, their first ever canoe trip. They read Last Entry Point before they went. They wrote me afterward and said, thanks for writing this book. We felt really knowledgeable about the actual dangers that can happen out here. We weren't just blindly stumbling through as we probably would have been before, and thanks for writing this book. So those types of that feedback has been really nice to hear from people after going through something like Rainy Last Entry Point, and that brings us up to where we are today in September. So I would definitely open this up to some questions or any feedback or anything that people have.
So what sort of limitations does search and rescue have in terms of going into the boundary waters? You know, with the motorized limitations for boats, what can search and rescue not do?
Well, somebody like Jim Morrison certainly knows a lot more about that than me, but I'll say just as briefly as I can and fill in the blanks if we need to, Jim, is that they need to ask permission most of the time to use a motor for search and rescue. Sometimes that's just kind of we're going, and that's what's going to happen here. We need to motor in like at Snipe Lake for this summer, for example. Curtin Falls obviously is the next level up. They're getting helicopters brought in, approval from Governor Walz, and like that's the scale up. So there's definitely a chain of command. The proper procedure, as it's probably written down somewhere, so to say, is ask the Forest Service, a call goes into Milwaukee, it's approved, comes back to Duluth, up the chain, okay, go. It depends on the circumstances, the necessity. I'm sure there's different tiers that would activate the use. But by and large, if there's a reason that they need to use a motor to go in and help someone, they're gonna damn well do it and ask forgiveness later.
The law allows that.
It does. It's not unheard of. In fact, I would say it's quite common that a motor is used for search and rescue in the boundary water. It's absolutely not unheard of. It's common.
The Wilderness Act provides for motorized use for emergencies, for rescue. So the way it works technically is we call and ask for permission, and Forest Supervisor can make that decision. He makes that decision. So we call, we get permission to use a motor if we need it. We also call, a lot of the rescues we do are with a beaver that can fly into these lakes a lot quicker sometimes than we can obviously paddle in. So then we get permission to use motors, usually like on Seagull, paddle, take canoes to the Alpine Portage, for example. Part of that's in the wilderness, and then paddle in. We've never been turned down. I did get once when I called in at 3 a.m. one night for somebody on South Lake. The person told me to not take my snowmobile up and down the staircase portage. I hadn't thought of doing that. But anyway, they've always let us use motors.
Yeah, thank you. Jim Morrison from the Gunflint Trail Fire Department, involved in many of the stories the Gunflint side that I talked about today. Any other questions about the writing, the gathering of these stories? Or feedback? Yeah.
After I read your book, I'm very old and I've been out many, many times with my life jacket on my feet. I read your book, my life jacket is on me.
That's great.
I'm not going to do that again.
Yeah, Rick at Curtin Falls, where they weren't wearing their life jackets this summer, and the brother who survived, 2 people survived that, 2 people died. He has done some interviews where he has said, I wish we would have been wearing our life jackets. We should have been wearing our life jackets. And I think he didn't have to say that, and I think it's great that he has been sort of saying that in NPR, Star Tribune, major publications where people are hearing that and processing that. People like anglers who are what this group was at Curtin Falls, taking that a little more seriously. It's a very simple step. Even though they may have died, they would have been projected out, and it wouldn't have taken 16 days had they been wearing them, and they just should have been wearing it anyway. So yeah, thanks for sharing that, definitely. Yep.
In Her Island, you had a similar story about some young men who ended up with the drowning there.
Yep.
Do you feel like you found some stories that sort of echoed each other in terms of reasoning for the death, or ways that the danger presented itself?
Yeah, yep. That situation that you talked about where Janice Matichuk, the longtime Cache Bay Ranger, saved 5 of the 6 she was able to rescue in that situation, all from Minnesota, young guys. One of them did drown on Sag near Cache Bay entry point there, that as you enter Cache Bay, and he was not wearing his life jacket. They weren't. That's definitely a commonality in some of these situations, is that if I'd have been wearing my life jacket, that might not have happened. That's probably the one. But even more broadly speaking, when we can bring in Billy Cameron's story, is cold water. A lot of these stories are from May. Ice comes out. People underestimate the wind. They see that it's sunny. Okay, look at this. We got this beautiful day to go paddling. Don't even think about the wind and what the water temperature is, and they fall in, capsize, and even if you're wearing a life jacket, it's still basically a life-threatening situation immediately. So cold water is probably the most common thread, and then wind and trees coming down.
Well, so I've paddled boundary waters for many years, like a lot of people, 100+ trips, and many youth trips that I've brought up, and reading your book convinced me that maybe it's time to get a satellite beacon. And I'm wondering if you have any comments about that or any recommendations.
Sure. Yeah, the outfitters will rent you a beacon sometimes. A lot of people are buying them now just to have them. Cell phone use is expanding across the BWCA. It's still pretty much non-existent in Quetico and parts over on this side of the wilderness, depending on your provider. So the beacon is at an interesting crossroads in the sense of cell phones expanding. Do I need to buy this expensive unit and have this thing? Is our cell phones gonna make people more prone to non-emergency calls to come help me? We saw some of that this summer with the guys that were on mushrooms off Siegel who were having a bad trip, and Jim and Michael and everybody had to go in and get them, and then when they got there, no, we're actually fine, we're all mellowed out now. So there's a lot of layers to, should you have a beacon? Should you work on self-recovery? It's wilderness area. It's an inherent risk. That as you go into these places that this could happen. I got a spot device this year. I haven't been carrying it yet, but I do a lot of solo winter stuff, and I think that I probably am going to. So there's not really, I don't want to make a recommendation necessarily. Talk to probably the outfitter, Rick Slatton is definitely sort of on the fence of, it's nice to have it, but don't abuse the damn thing. Don't think that that's your free pass out of here. He'll tell you a story about the guy who lost his canoe paddle deep in the wilderness, 6-7 portages in, hits the beacon. It's not one that can communicate back and forth. So all they know is that somebody's out there. Same thing that happened. I think the people did say they ate a mushroom. They didn't know. These guys didn't know if it was psychedelic or some sort of toxic, like the guy's dying of poison from the mushrooms. But in that case with the paddle, the guy, St. Louis County squad goes in, he's 7-8 portages, they get to the last known spot where the guy set off the beacon. He's at camp making coffee, and they're like, is this, what's up? Is this the scene? The guy's like, yeah, my paddle floated away. It's the damnedest thing, And they're like, we just, these are like volunteers that have now schlepped in, left their families, left dinner, all this kind of stuff. Get in there. You lost your paddle. Like, you use a stick, you improvise, you do whatever you got to do to get out of that. You're in a wilderness area. That's the other side of these beacons. But nice to have. If somebody's solo and a tree falls on them and you're pinned and you can't move. Nice to have.
On the topic of the beacon, some of you from Cranberry area may know Lucky Prey.
Sure.
And I used to go to Alaska all the time backpacking, so I kind of monitor the Anchorage Daily News, because through newspapers, at least until you get so many articles in every month. And Lonnie DeGray decided that he wanted to climb Mount Denali in the wintertime solo. And so he flies in, he goes into Talkeetna, and he treks all the way up to the mountain. And he got close to the top the first year, but then he had to go back down. And the second year, he summited. But so like, if you're by yourself, how do you prove that you actually got to the top? He had this satellite phone beacon thing for communications, and that has the GPS coordinates that are associated with it.
Mm.
That's how it improves the sound.
Yeah, I was just out with the DNR this past week in the Boundary Waters and doing some fish survey, journalism things with them in the BWC, and they used the satellite phone to communicate with the Forest Service while I was out there, and it definitely was a very effective, expensive gadget to have. The satellite phone is not cheap. The beacons aren't cheap, and so it's another reason to talk to an outfitter, because they can rent you one. Even that's becoming less common, actually. So this is the whole thing about beacons is we could go on for hours about it.
So I've never seen a beacon, but does the beacon establish GPS coordinates?
Yes, it tells them, right, Jim? That's you're going to know when somebody pushes that thing where they're at, generally speaking, and if they're moving stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got the Garmin InReach one, which it costs about $500 to buy it. It's a $29 a month subscription. But it'll allow you to communicate, like text messages. It's got the emergency button on the side. You have to unwrap it to hit the button. It's not easy. And it'll give you the weather, and it'll give you all the traffic. And I'm up here alone a lot, and for me, my kids say, you gotta have a partner.
Yeah, right. And so, a thing about people who come maybe once, they're going to do one trip. Do they need to buy a beacon and make it a big thing? Probably not. Maybe you should think about renting one or have a really good contingency plan in place. I talk about this pretty extensively through the eyes of these experts in the book. So the last in conclusion about Last Entry Point is that the winter, which is hopefully approaching pretty soon, not far, there's barely any deaths. People typically don't die in the Boundary Waters in the winter. Things are locked up. We're mostly free of that idea of capsizing and going to be in the water, in cold water. Even if you fall in, a lot of people have extra clothes and people with them, and they can get themselves out of these situations a lot easier than rolling around in the waves and the canoe and all that bobbing and stuff that goes on. So winter is actually, there's hardly any reference to it. There's just those people from Loon Lake here that died in the 80s, I think that was, when they came up to find space people or some kind of crazy story. If people were around for that or remember that story. But that's one of the only examples of somebody that died in this area during the winter in the Boundary Waters. There's some medical related things that happen, heart attacks from people, but by and large winter is safer. It's those shoulder seasons. It's May, late September, October, and those are the times that we need to definitely be aware. And if you have people, loved ones, family, friends going in those shoulder seasons, which are awesome, the bugs are down, the fishing can be really good, especially in May. It's just like, gotta be safe. You gotta take those extra levels of precaution. Check it out. Read Last Entry Point, share these stories, listen to the family members, listen to the interview with Natalie. You can hear it in her voice, what happens when you lose somebody in the Boundary Waters, even if it is, there's that feeling of they died in their favorite place. There's still that grief, that realness that we're talking about when we talk about people dying in a place like the Boundary Waters. And so keep paddling, keep living, and thank you so much for being here. I think we're out of time, I think. I'll be up here signing books, and if you got a copy, bring it up. I'd love